right and left. One of the things that, one thing we want to mention right off is the title of our sermon, if we had a title, would be Take a Little Honey Along. And I love that song that Sam selected. Forgiveness is like honey on my lips. Yes, exactly. The first wedding that Joan and I attended when we were missionaries in Kenya was in the Meru culture. And in the Meru culture, when people are married, the man's parents give the bride's parents, this is quite a thing. This is in the Meru culture. Gives them 4 cows, a ewe, a ram, and a small barrel of honey. The honey is to sweeten the loss of the daughter. There you go. It's an important part of the transaction, and we discovered that honey is an important thing in the economy of that culture in Africa. We're looking at the story of Joseph this morning. It'll be Joseph and Jacob kind of intertwined. And you remember that story? We may just summarize briefly and talk about the fact that Joseph, at 16 years of age, was sold as a slave into Egypt by his brothers, 10 brothers who took part in that. And that's in Genesis chapter 37. But in all of the tribulations in Egypt, we could go through that, take too much time, but he emerges somehow as the second in command of all of Egypt. Here's a 16-year-old sold by his brothers into slavery, and now, because he's able to interpret a dream by the Pharaoh, that there would be 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. And so Joseph interprets this dream of the Pharaoh, and then the leaders of Egypt say, who has wisdom like this? Let's put this man in charge. And so Joseph is placed in charge, not even from Egypt, and placed him in charge of gathering up of corn. And it says, I love this in Genesis, it says, there was so much corn that Joseph even gave up on keeping track of it. Sound like God's grace, doesn't it? Oh my. And so there was a famine throughout, not just Egypt, but all over the place. Now, his family is back up in Canaan. And so, of course, they get caught up in this as well. And Jacob now has the 10 sons, and Joseph, who has now gone away, they think he's just disappeared. And, of course, Benjamin, the younger brother. And so they're looking at each other, and Jacob says, how long are you guys going to just look at each other? Don't get on down to Egypt and buy some corn. We understand that there's some corn down there. Buy corn. Well, on their way down they go. And when they get there, they meet this guy. He's a mean dude, this guy. And he just says, what? I know about you guys. You're spies is what you are. You've come to spy out the land to see where the weakness is. You can attack it. Oh, no, we are your servants. Do you remember the... Do you remember the dream? I see Jenny nodding. Do you remember the dream he had? When they would be bowing down. That's exactly what happens here. And they cast themselves, no, we're your servants. We just need to have a little bit of corn. Well, tell me about your family. Well, one brother's gone. We don't know what happened to him. They're talking to him right now. Although it's not in the Hebrew language, it's all done through translation. And Joseph looks very different, obviously, at this point. But he said, well, okay, I'll tell you what we're going to do. We'll sell you corn this time, but we're going to keep one of you in prison. And when you come back, bring your younger brother. By the way, how is your younger brother? You mentioned him. He's talking about a member of his family. How's your father? He's talking about a member, the father. And so, anyway, get on with the story. They keep Simeon in prison, and away they go back home again. And we pick up a story there in Genesis chapter 43. We'll read 11 through 14. You see it there in front of you, and it reads this way. Then their father Israel said to them, if it must be then, do this. Now he's talking about their return to buy more corn because the corn's finished. Put some of the best products of the land in your bags and take them down to the man as a gift. A little balm, a little honey, some spices and myrrh, some pistachio nuts and almonds. Take double the amount of silver with you, for you must return the silver that was put back into the mouths of your sacks. Perhaps it was a mistake. Take your brother also, and go back to the man at once. And may God Almighty grant you mercy before the man, so that he will let your other brother and Benjamin come back with you, As for me, I am bereaved, I am bereaved. And when there's a repetition of a phrase like there is here, that means what we would say in Creole, in Haiti, is we would say, Doyale, mem, mem, mem. That means yes, yes, yes. And so that's the situation here. I'm totally, I'm at my wit's end here. Here's one gone, and you're taking my younger one, and you guys are all going. Well, on and on it goes. So he tells his sons to do three things. Take the silver back because you owe it. Take the second payment of silver along. You have to pay for the corn. And take a little honey, he says. Now, let me ask you, where did Jacob learn all this? Jacob was a thief. He was a liar. He stole the birthright of his older brother in Esau. That's in chapter 32. And he begs for forgiveness, remember, going back up to face his brother. He has two families now. And he's going back to face Esau. Stole his birthright, stole cattle from his father-in-law. Other than that, he's just fine. All night long now. It's the night before he meets Esau, and he thinks it's gonna. He sends everybody ahead. I hope you guys fare well over there. And then he spends time talking to God. And there is something marvelous that happens in the life of Jacob that night. Jacob emerges after battling all night with God in the form of an angel, a changed character, a changed person. And he told Jacob, your name will no longer be Jacob but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome. Now in the Old Testament, as we all know, when one's character changes, oftentimes one name was changed. And so it was not Jacob any longer, it was Israel. That's the children of Israel. And he struggled there. And it says, and his hip was disjointed. And I think that he walked with a limp forever after that. I walk with a limp to this day. Because there was a change in my life and my conduct. There was a change in my character when I faced him face to face with the Lord Jesus Christ and laid my life down and said, God, you be in charge from now on. And I walk with a limp to this day. Well, something dramatic happened to Jacob here. It's Israel now. Now Jacob has been wronged. He's one that's been wronging people forever. Why would this evil big shot in Egypt want to accuse his boys of spying? Of spying? They're not spies. They're liars. They're thieves. They're murderers. But they're not spies. And so he decides he'll better send a gift along to this dictator. Maybe he can somehow, we would say, grease the palm a little bit, as it were. Now, a couple of things here for us to look at really, really hurriedly. The first is, I want us to take a little look at honey in the Holy Land. Canaan was called a land of milk and honey. You find that numerous times in the Old Testament. Exodus 3, the word to Moses. This is a plentiful land I'm sending you to. This would be in Canaan, not in Egypt. Now, this is the first mention of honey in the Old Testament. It kind of catches our attention. Honey has a natural health effect on heart health, including reduced blood pressure on fat levels, wound healing, and blood antioxidant status. It's been shown to reduce several factors leading to heart disease. I want to get our jar of honey out, don't you, after all that? Later, get this now, 300 camels loaded with honey would be sent annually from Hebron to Egypt. 300 camels loaded with honey. What would that be? Would that be, Trav, a mile spread out, maybe, of camels? I don't know, but all loaded with honey. Now, great amounts in Canaan, little or none in Egypt. Because you see, agricultural richness would be necessary for the production of honey. And when God gave Abraham the promise in Genesis chapter 12, he blessed them with an ancestry. There would be people who would populate this land, but the land itself would produce remarkably. That's required for the bees to find enough to make this honey. God had promised Abraham a land as well as an offspring, and honey was a byproduct. Now, bees they can't consume as much honey as they produce, so something or someone has got to confiscate it, or it's wasted. Now, there are 7 species of fruit and juice listed in the Torah. Honey was the culmination of all the species that preceded it. It sets it apart. It's the latest and it's the best. Even the manna provided to the Israelites fleeing Egypt was what tasted like pastry, fried in honey, so a sweet taste. I'm saying, how about a little of that and some coffee right now? That'd go down right fine. That sounds all right. The Israelites, now, God, get this. The Israelites began to teach their children at the age of 3 the alphabet. They dropped a speck of honey on each letter printed on a board. And when the children licked it off, they would memorize that letter. Wow, yeah. So when Joseph saw the honey, there was a deep meaning behind it. He knew what it cost. It wasn't just any gift. It was a highly prized gift in that culture. And as I was thinking about this, I'm wondering, it's very possible that COVID in our generation was what the famine was to Jacob, because of an extreme cost in both cases. But God can help us to recover. Well, one son was dead now, Jacob thinks. And now they want to take Benjamin to Egypt, or another one of his sons, Ephraim, is in prison. And so there's a little bit of desperation here. But a psalm in Psalm 34:18 says, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those crushed in spirit." Well, what happens here, just to flesh the whole thing out, is that they go down, sure enough, they take Benjamin down there to Egypt. And sure enough, they meet this rough and tough dude down there. And he meets the younger brother and doesn't act too emotional about it. But he sends them on back. They paid their money twice over now, sends them all back. But he has his steward put his golden cup in the sack of Benjamin. On their way back, now the steward overtakes him and says, "What are you doing, stealing the silver cup? That's how my master divines the future." Kind of an Egyptian take on that, isn't it? And what are you doing? And he herds them all back. Oh, guys, this is so emotional. He herds them all back, and they get back, and he tells them, thieves like I told you and all, and then it says, all of a sudden, the emotion of having all of them back here. He's punished them enough, you see. I guess you might say it that way, for what has happened. And are they truly ready for a change? And so he says, clear the house. He says this in the Egyptian language. Everybody leaves. And it says he cried so loudly, the whole palace heard. Emotion. How deep is emotion in our lives, brothers and sisters? If we could visit the thousands of jails all over the world, would it not be true that many or most of the people in each one was there because of an emotional explosion? Something that happened at a time in their life when things got out of control. So deep here is this. And then he explains that he is Joseph, and they can't believe it. They're still falling down at his feet, by the way. And he explains who he is, and he talks about that. Honey out of Israel, the Holy Land, a land of milk and honey, is exported to a pagan nation. Can a gift of love and peace and grace flow from our hearts when we are at the lowest point in life? It can only happen by God's grace. Of all people, holiness people ought to be most about taking along a little honey. We have no way of producing honey ourselves. It's a gift of God that we now offer to people who have wronged us. It's God's grace flowing to us. The grace of God is mediated through us to one another. God works inescapably in my life through the people and events that he brings into my life. Now Jacob's gift is returned to him, only it's multiplied. Here's grace returned, honey flowing back into our lives. It's the return even when we don't deserve it. It's the result of a dogged determination to do what is right, even when I'm at the lowest point of my life. Well, the story ends in chapter 46 with Jacob and the whole tribe moving down to Egypt. See, Joseph is a prototype of Jesus. He says in the end, last chapter 2 of Genesis, he says, God knew what he was doing sending me down there. Yes, there was suffering involved, but he sent me there to save, for the saving of people. What about Jesus coming, suffering, giving his life so that many could be saved. He's a prototype of Jesus. Now, there are some opportunities, it seems to me, for honey opportunities today. If we were to ask ourselves, okay, what happens in our lives when a changed heart and a grace-filled heart says it's time for a little honey now? Now, you may find when this happens and your grace flows in your life that you become a very changed person. Your conduct may be very much changed. You may amaze yourself. What are some of those times in our lives? At the risk of sounding like someone who's really knowledgeable here, let me just suggest 4 areas. Very simple, very simple. It's much more complex than they get books about it. But it seems to me that there are 4 areas that when we need to experience somehow God producing grace in us to extend to others, and then seeing that flow back to us in ways we could never have predicted. First of all, times and events that we don't understand. Times and events that we don't understand. Just as in the life of Jacob, chapter 43, that there was shock with what happened to Jacob, left and right. And he said, I'm just defeated. I'm at the bottom here. I'm at the very bottom. Those happen to in our lives as well. And as in the life of Jacob in chapter 43, it comes with a shock. There was one illustration of that in Southern California back in about 2016. There was a bill that was produced by a senator. It was called SB 1146. And what it would do, it would clamp down on all universities. Didn't matter the denomination. It didn't matter if they're secular, Christian, whatever. It would clamp down on them until it would restrict Christian colleges in ways that would violate their charter. And so the evangelical church rose up in California and said, we will not obey that. But they didn't say it that way. And so Dr. Kevin Manoia was chaplain at Azusa Pacific. Outstanding guy. And he gathered us all together. I was there as part of the Ministerial Studies Board for Southern California District. And we went up there to Azusa Pacific, big auditoriums filled with educators, lawyers, people with their opinions. People of the big churches down in San Diego were there with their viewpoints. And everybody was allowed to express that. It went on and on. And the conclusion was, we will not obey this. We simply cannot obey that. And then we got an email from Kevin Manoia at the end of it all. The email came to us, and he concluded it by saying this. This is his quote. Let's let all of our responses to this bill and to government officials, spoken or written, be kind and charitable and loving. Just a beautiful, beautiful phrase. And I looked over at Proverbs 16:7, and I read this. When a man's ways are pleasing to the Lord, he makes even his enemies live at peace with him. Well, the vote was taken, and we were shocked. It was overturned. We were shocked. And yet it was a little honey that was flowing out. We did not, go on TV and all the ads and the kinds of stuff that we'd be glad will be finished on Tuesday. Then what are they going to do for ads? Anyway. And so it was overturned, and we just rejoiced. But we thought, we've learned something here. Be graceful in the way that we respond, and God blesses that grace. I say there's another, and that is our spouse. In times of deep anguish and suffering, sometimes it's the spouse that becomes the target of abuse. The last one who should, but for some reason, they're there, and they take the brunt of this. But a little bit of honey, in Proverbs again, 16:24, says this, a little honey. Where is it here? Pleasant words are a honeycomb, sweet to the soul and healing to the bones. And honeycombs, of course, is where honeys return after gathering nectar. They go back, they regurgitate what they've swallowed, and they put it, this is an interesting thing. And they put it in that honeycomb, and it's stored there until somebody else takes it. Well, it happened. We were amazed. Well, spouses, in times of deep anguish and suffering, the spouse might become the target of abuse. It's anything but a little bit of honey. Honey is a healing agent. It has healing qualities. Perhaps it is needed here as much as anywhere. Husband and wife, be sure and take a little bit of honey. It's God's grace operative in our lives, working to someone who is very, very close to us. Dr. Fulton Ausler is a marriage counselor, and he said, say the heartening thing at the right time, husband or wife, and you're adding a little bit of marriage insurance. Well, there's another, and that would be our children. Take a little honey along. Children particularly are in need of parents' reassurance, their love, and in some cases their pity. As a father pitieth his children, so the Lord pitieth those that fear him. Love and reassurance. And sometimes at the time when we come home and we're frustrated by work or frustrated by what's going on in the family or whatever, it can be so easy to just vent your wrath on the most vulnerable, in some cases children. I remember reading about the father of Adam Clark. This is back in the 18th century in Ireland. The father of Adam Clark took him he was rural, and he took him to the teacher, and he said to the teacher, he's a little boy, he said to the teacher, well, I don't expect too much, he didn't look too bright. Teacher looked at the boy and he said, well, I don't know, he looks all right to me, he looks bright enough to me. Adam Clark would become a doctor of divinity, of course. He wrote 8 volumes, each volume at least 800 or 900 pages. That was the book that the Methodist pastors used to study the Bible and prepare sermons for 200 years. One of the very best. And a holiness commentator. When I do for my class, I read Adam Clark. And just beautiful, beautiful way he develops this whole matter of grace flowing in our lives and in the lives of holiness people. Well, let us look upon our children in a different way than Adam Clark's father did. He wrote them out a much. My mother used to say, Terry, you're in a rural family up in Western Canada on a farm, and said, you know what I want you to be? I want you to be the head of a Bible college. I said, sure, Mom. I'm in 9th grade now, and Dad took me out of school for a year, and I felt like God wanted me back in school, so I took off from home. Told him the night before. My dad, you didn't tell him in advance. You told him the night before. Took off the next day. Never went back home again to become a minister. And down through the years, sure enough, we worked in Haiti, worked in Brazil, came back, taught at seminary, and then we were appointed to Africa. And I find out that my job was, our position, our task, was to provide extension education for 600 to 700 students in all of East Africa. And I wrote and told my mom that I'd be in charge of this school that she hoped, but she said, oh, not in another country. That'd be okay as long as it was here. What about our church? We're talking about opportunities for honey here. The sharing of grace mediated through our lives. What about our church? Perhaps we are in need of a little honey as much now as at any time in our 100-year history. How do we treat each other? How do we communicate? Take a little honey along with you. It heals. The way we communicate with each other, will attest if we'd had a hip replacement or not. Character change. Thomas Moore was an 18th century author, lyricist, songwriter, popular, wealthy, had a wife with smallpox, developed smallpox, very contagious. And back in the 18th century, one could be disfigured and scarred, and in fact, many died. She develops smallpox, and now the wife of Thomas Moore secludes herself, withdraws from life, shuts herself up in her room with the drapes closed. It's dark, no sunlight, no light, nothing, would communicate with no one. And even with her husband, only for food or what have you. And he's wondering what to do about this. And so finally he takes pen and paper and he writes this. Believe me, if all these endearing young charms, which I gaze on so fondly today, were to change by tomorrow and flee from my arms like fairy gifts fading away, that would still be adored at this moment thou art. Let thy loveliness fade as it will, and around the dear ruins each wish of my heart would entwine itself verdantly still. She put the paper down, rose from her bed, put on her gown, and went and flung back those dark red drapes and let the sunshine flow into the room and into her very soul. Pleasant words are a honeycomb, sweet to the soul and healing for the body. Brother, sister, take along a little honey.